We forgot about Firewatch. Hold on, don't type the comments. I am sure you specifically didn't forget about Firewatch as you found this video, and because you probably came from our Firewatch. What I mean is that we forgot about Firewatch as a culture. Let me explain. The latest entry to the Blue People rip-off Pocahontas franchise has sparked a discussion on cultural relevance. Before the second Avatar film was released, a bunch of people were criticizing the first film for not making an impact on the culture despite it being one of the most commercially successful films of all time. And to a certain extent, I feel that this critique rings true. We didn't talk about Avatar that much after 2009. Unfortunately, I feel the same way about Firewatch. This game made ripples in the gaming industry during its launch in 2016, but since then its legacy has been reduced to cool wallpapers, a semi-active subreddit, a beef with a popular YouTuber, and a disappointing ending. If you've encountered Firewatch in the last 7 years, I suspect that the thing you've seen is either those wallpapers or a discussion about the ending. In this video, I want to dig deeper into Firewatch. I want to see how the game holds up 7 years after its launch. I want to figure out why this game didn't leave the impact that I felt that it deserved. This video is long, considering that Firewatch is a 4 to 5 hour game. However, I wanted to examine the different choices that the player can make and how they affect the story. The choices in Firewatch differ a lot from the developer's previous game, The Walking Dead for example, which is why it is important to examine these choices in detail. I will also deliberately recap the narrative itself, as it has been 7 years since the launch, and I don't think most people will remember the events of the narrative. We are going to be starting with the gameplay section, which I've kept free of narrative spoilers. However, if you don't want to know anything about this game, you should probably play it. I mean, it's been 7 years. I think you've had a chance to do so, but hey, let's go with the assumption that this is your first time hearing about Firewatch. I have also written this essay so that people who haven't played the game can also watch it. So no worries there. After that, we are going to move into how choices work in Firewatch, and then to the narrative and its analysis. These sections contain spoilers for the game, and I will make a note of it when we get there. So, without a further ado, let's begin. Firewatch's gameplay is extremely simple. The main gameplay objectives are 1. Wait for your boss to contact you and inform you about the things you are doing today, and 2. Doing those things exactly. Some of you who have already played the game are probably a bit amused about how simplistic this description of the game is, but if we are looking at the bare bones, this is what it's all about. Firewatch is a walking simulator. You walk from point A to point B, interact with a thing, receive new orders, and then move from point B to point C, etc, etc. There are alterations to this basic formula, and sometimes the player themselves has to figure out where to go next, but there's no denying that the majority of the game is just walking around the map. I don't want to come off sounding like this is a bad thing in itself. I really enjoy playing games like this, but it does demand a certain type of player. The term walking simulator is often used as a pejorative, but I think the gameplay makes sense for this game specifically, and it gives more space to the things that actually matter in the game, those being the narrative, the graphics, and the music. The protagonist has a map and a compass, and it is up to the player to actually orientate themselves to the objective. Apart from these tools, the game doesn't actually help you in this regard at all. If you mistake the direction that you are going, you might walk minutes into the wrong direction only to notice that you were heading south when you should have been going north. However, it is impossible to actually get lost in this game. The entire map is structured along paths, which are fairly easy to find, and straying off them will lead to dead ends or just environmental textures which Henry can walk through. So even though the game is quote-unquote open world, in the sense that you get a medium-sized map to explore, the game does heavily force you to take the paths that have been already laid out by the developers. These invisible walls even exist in places that it really doesn't make sense. It often feels like the protagonist is wearing boots made from concrete. The player is stuck to the ground at all times, except when doing these sweet parkour moves or when climbing rocks or ropes.
Radical.
Sean Veneman, a lead developer on the game, actually reflected on these gameplay decisions in a Polygon interview 1 year after the launch of Firewatch. We wanted to make a game where you had the sensation of wandering around. It's fun to be lost in the real world, but it's not fun to be lost in a video game. You get bored really fast. So we wanted to give you the fun of being lost while always being able to find your way. We carved the space from terrain as opposed to thinking about it like corridors and walls. We started to feel the way we wanted it to feel. It was important to us that there was this buffer, so before you hit a wall, you knew you were off the beaten path. We pushed the walls as far away as possible. I admired the idea behind this design philosophy, I really do. However, the sensation of wandering around doesn't really make any sense when there isn't all that much to discover in the world. The walls that were pushed as far away as possible aren't really all that far. If you actually try to get lost in this world, you will bounce on these invisible walls like a ball in a pinball machine. Leaving the beaten path can yield some interesting Easter eggs, however. A few achievements in the game are only accessible if the player decides to wander a bit. For example, Life and Times of Raccoon Carter can only be unlocked if the player finds this abandoned hut, and only if the player interacts with this small oven on the right day. But it's not like this hut is hidden from the player. The player can actually find it very early in the game by following the boss's objectives, and there it is. So the exploration element of Firewatch doesn't really feel like real exploration. You kinda just stumble onto these optional parts while doing other stuff. I wouldn't go out looking for these hidden locations specifically, because there just aren't that many of them in the game. At least one of these optional hidden locations is blocked off from the player and can only be accessed by receiving an item that lets you into that location. Actually finding this spot without stumbling onto it randomly or without the use of a guide requires the player to have a second tool. So that's 2 tools that you basically need for this spot. I hesitate to use the word Metroidvania in this context, as this game is about as far from a Metroidvania as one can get, but it is similar to those games in this one example. Henry finds a bunch of equipment that can be utilized. For example, a fire axe, a Pulaski for the initiated by the way, ropes, climbing anchors, etc. How Firewatch actually differs from a Metroidvania is in its design around these items. Let's take the Pulaski for example. The protagonist finds it to break a lock, and after that is done, the player can utilize it to chop down partially hacked trees or clear out brambles. But that doesn't really give the player anything. For example, this tree gives the player a shortcut which is maybe 5 to 10 seconds faster than the original route, to a place the player doesn't have any reason to visit after this point in the game. Weird, right? Clearing the brambles also just provides more shortcuts, apart from the narrative use of the Pulaski. The one optional location mentioned earlier requires the player to have the wave receiver tool and the Pulaski. This hidden location gives the achievement Ol Shoshane, and a tape in which Chris Remo, the game's composer, sings the song Ol Shoshane, which was also used in the intro to this video. This hidden location also wraps up a subplot for 2 off-screen minor characters. So that's pretty cool, right? You find items to discover these hidden nukes of the world that were unavailable to the player previously. The problem here is that this is the only place that I found that was worth noting. The others that I found were just shortcuts. I would like to move on from this, but I have to stress how disappointing this is. It's neat that the player has tools, but what is the point of having them if there's only one thing to actually find in the world apart from the pointless shortcuts? I don't need Firewatch to all of a sudden become a game where you can fight with an axe. I know this isn't Hollow Knight, but just give me something, anything that I can do with these items that isn't just in regards to the narrative or shortcuts. Maybe I'm asking too much, but as it stands, the equipment in this game only functions as an artificial block for the player not to progress too far into the story locations. And that makes sense, by the way. But if that's the case, why are there then these optional shortcuts thrown around? I don't understand it. Honestly, I would have been happy with just a few optional places that require these tools and have nice views or something. I don't need anything animated, just a nice view from a top of a cliff or something like that. Now, that is not to say that there aren't other rewards for optional exploration. The player can, for example, find the raccoon mentioned earlier and even a pet turtle. There are also many things in the world that our protagonist can point out to their boss, and these are genuinely cool. The devs even went out of their way to give the player different dialogue options based on what has already happened in the game in terms of story. But let's discuss those a bit more in the next section. The player can also find a disposable camera which can take pictures which will be displayed in the end credits. It's a neat little optional thing that doesn't really have an impact on the game. I mean, let's be real, there's only one thing you want to take pictures of. I left out the most important tool in Firewatch in the last section. This tool is the one that will be utilized the most by the player during their summer. In fact, it is so key to the game that it replaces the most common place for the run button. By pressing the shift key, Henry, the protagonist by the way, brings up a walkie-talkie. At the other end of said walkie-talkie is Henry's boss Delilah. The conversations between the two are the most prominent element of the game. I would go as far as to say that these conversations are the game. And hey, before I progress any further, I have to say that this too is gameplay. But it is also the way that the story is told, and that is why I chose this arbitrary distinction between the quote-unquote walk A to B gameplay and the press shift to talk gameplay. Firewatch's main draw is the dialogue and narrative that revolves around Henry and Delilah. The graphics and the music are a highlight also, but without the dialogue, I think this game would lose its charm.
No kidding. Well, let me hike over.
Well, it's locked up and mainly for emergencies. I've never actually used it. Rangers use it from time to time, but that's it.
Help! Oh, God, it's an emergency!
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got eyes on a tornado. I gotta get out of here.
A tornado in the heart of the Rockies?
Yes!
Holy moly, I need to call this in. Tom, Two Forks sees a tornado. He says he needs an evac into my sector. It's a meteorological impossibility. There haven't been tornadoes in the greater Yellowstone region in 100 million years. You're gonna need him to stay and take a detailed personal account, even if it means giving his life. Okay, I'll tell him. Sorry, Hank. No dice.
Man.
But anyway, back to the points. The walkie-talkie gives the player many kinds of choices. You can choose how you respond to Delilah when she calls. You can report things to Delilah that you find in the wild. You can also choose to stay silent, which is a nice option to have, but this does lead to some very awkward situations.
Smoke, but when the sun is down, you can just get lost.
Yeah, that's very profound. Can I go to sleep now, please?
I'm glad you're here.
I haven't said anything. I mean, I guess it's just nice to hear that someone is listening to you.
I don't talk to the other lookouts as much as I talk to you. Not in the same way.
Many will immediately recognize this type of gameplay from other adventure games like Telltale's The Walking Dead, Quantic Dream's Detroit Become Human or Heavy Rain, and lastly, Don't Nod's Life is Strange, those being probably the most popular examples. Now, of course, there's a massive difference between these games in how the player's choice affects the game itself. I think it's fairly common knowledge at this point that Telltale's method is for the game to give the player some choices which flavor the game, but don't actually affect the game's events. The starting point is the same for everyone, the changes affect things that the player experiences throughout the game, only for it to culminate in an ending that basically everyone gets. I saw a meme on Reddit that displayed this style of storytelling perfectly, but I unfortunately cannot find it. So instead, I did the meme again in Paint, which resulted in this masterpiece. All the players begin from the same start point. They make a choice which splits the players into two different branching paths. After that, there's another branch which splits the players even more, and in the end, they all end up in the same place again. In the next game or episode or whatever, the branching choices will be totally undone, so as to ensure that the players actually get the content that is designed for them, and so it goes on. In comparison, Quantic Dreams' games change based on the decisions that the player makes. Some of the characters that the player controls might not be there for the ending if you make poor enough choices. Firewatch is an interesting game as it definitely leans more towards the Telltale approach, but then again, the choices that the player makes are even less impactful than in The Walking Dead, for example. Considering that Campo Santo is made up of Telltale alumni, the similar gameplay isn't all that surprising. What is surprising, however, is the grounded style of the narrative, the lack of characters the player can interact with, and just the overall mood of Firewatch. There isn't anything supernatural going on in Firewatch. It's a game about grief and how that grief can manifest in different ways. It's an incredibly down-to-earth experience, which also ties into why audiences were disappointed with the ending, but we'll get to that. The choices that the player makes through Firewatch seem inconsequential. There's nothing that the player can say or do that will suddenly kill off a character, for example. In fact, there aren't even that many characters that have an on-screen presence, and by that logic, could be killed off. The choices that the player makes don't lead to new levels or events in the narrative. The narrative follows the track that it was always going to follow. There isn't a good ending or a bad ending, for example. The events of the game are predetermined. With all that being said, I would like to reinforce the statement that the choices seem inconsequential. While the events are predetermined, the choices that the player makes do change the context of said events. And I need to illustrate this, so let's go through a few examples of choice in Firewatch. Before I begin, I would like to note that when I say a choice, it can refer either to the dialogue option the player chooses or the things that the player can optionally point out in the world. Additionally, the term outcome is meant to represent the end result of said choice. For example, the choice to point out a turtle to Delilah leads to the outcome of said turtle being in this drawing at the end of the game. First example. During the game, Henry is having a conversation with Delilah. Delilah asks what Henry looks like, to which the player can then choose their option from a list of 4, counting in the option to actually stay silent. This choice doesn't actually change how Henry looks. In fact, the player already knows what Henry looks like from the beginning of the game, and nothing is going to change that. What this option changes is the picture Delilah draws of Henry, which the player finds at the end of the narrative. This example shows that while the choice doesn't change the gameplay itself or the narrative, or even the relationship between Henry and Delilah, it does have an impact on this small detail found in the end. So this particular instance of player choice only leads to a small visual outcome. Second example. The game begins with a short text-based segment in which the player is given the choice between 2 dogs, a beagle named Bucket or a German shepherd named Mayhem. The choice has its first outcome in the opening segment itself. The dog will either run away or be kicked by a mugger. The second outcome is later in the game when Henry has the choice to say that he has a dog named Bucket or Mayhem. Although we never see the dog, we have a choice which changes a minor part of Henry's backstory, that being the type of dog that he had. This choice doesn't have any impact on the story itself, but it builds our understanding of what kind of a character we are controlling. Unlike the previous example of Delilah's drawing, this choice doesn't have any outcome that is visual or could be pointed towards. The third and final example. In the beginning text-based segment, it is shown that Henry likes to go to bars. In fact, the first scene shown to us is in a bar. Henry is then later shown to enjoy a drink on the deck of his apartment and enjoying bars even more after his life takes an unfortunate turn, let's call it. The player can also receive a DUI in this opening segment, but it's not actually tied to this drinking. The DUI can also be brought up to Delilah later in the game. The player also has the choice to hide this information from Delilah by simply never telling her about this incident. Additionally, the player can find a whiskey bottle in the game. The player has the choice to either pocket said whiskey bottle or to leave it. All of these examples shape what kind of a character Henry is. The first example bases Henry as a character that will either tell the truth, lie, or stay silent about his appearance. The outcome of this choice is a visualization of the things that Henry describes to Delilah. However, there is a contextual element to this choice as well. If Henry lies to Delilah, he could do so as he wants to joke around. It could also be that Henry doesn't want to tell Delilah what he looks like because he is afraid that he is not Delilah's type. So maybe there's an ulterior motive of Henry trying to hit on Delilah. Now, none of this is in the text itself, of course. Henry doesn't whisper that he shouldn't tell Delilah anything because he is deeply afraid of Delilah's reaction, for example. This is all open to the player's own interpretation of these choices. The second example leads to a more tangible outcome. The dog will be either kicked or it will run away. The dog will never stop the mugging, even if the player first picks the beagle, who gets kicked, and on a second playthrough picks the German Shepherd, who just runs away. However, the choice of said dog represents Henry as a character. Is he a guy who gets a cute dog for the sake of the dog being cute, or does he get a dog to keep his wife safe? Neither of these choices leads to an outcome in which Henry isn't mugged, but it does affect what kind of a character Henry is. The choice also ripples into the later game, as the player has the option to reveal that Henry has a dog or that he doesn't, further, once again, developing the character of Henry. The third and final example also, you guessed it, affects what kind of a character Henry is. For example, were the mentions of Henry frequenting bars a sign of his alcoholism, or is he just a casual drinker? Is he secretive about his DUI, hiding it from Delilah? Maybe Henry is a recovering alcoholic who can't resist stealing the whiskey bottle. Maybe Henry does resist, first taking it and then putting it back.
Probably don't need this in my life right now.
Maybe Henry initially takes it to confiscate it but ends up drinking it. And so on and so on. Okay, so let's stop here. Is this making any sense at all, or does it all seem like BS on my part? Am I projecting too much onto the game, essentially role-playing as Henry when the game isn't actually this deep? Now, that may be the case, but I would also ask, why do these choices exist in the game if this isn't the intended purpose for them? Let's take a few incredibly unfair comparisons just for the sake of comparison. Think about the level of choice that a game like The Witcher 3 gives to the player. There are many different conversations the player can have leading to different outcomes. Even the minor side quests have multiple different outcomes based on the player's choice. Characters minor or major can die based on how Geralt feels about the situation. This game has so many different outcomes that it made Joseph Anderson retire early. That's a joke, by the way, Mr. Anderson. Please finish the video. Firewatch doesn't have any characters that die off because Henry decides to pick the wrong dialogue option. The most tangible outcomes in Firewatch are visual. Henry adopts the turtle. Henry finds a whiskey bottle and keeps it. If you collect enough notes in Henry's watchtower, it can end up looking like the Pepe Sylvia wall from It's Always Sunny. Which is kind of funny considering the turns that the narrative takes. Well, that actually kind of rhymes. These, however, don't affect the story whatsoever. Okay, now I'm just rapping. The story is predetermined. It's not a telltale waterfall which branches off only to reunite in the end. Apart from the visual outcomes that we have mentioned so far, the choices in Firewatch contextualize the path that the player takes as Henry. The player gets to decide what kind of a character Henry is in his backstory and how that changes through the narrative of Firewatch. This differs, for example, from The Walking Dead, as Lee Everett is a character whose past we don't actually get to shape. Does this mean that the narrative of Firewatch is good though? That's something that we'll have to discuss by looking at the events of the game more in depth. But before we do that, let's take a word from our sponsor today. Okay, I don't actually have any sponsors. I mean, come on, I have like 15 subscribers. But hey, if you want to be the 16th, click that subscribe button for more content like this. Anyway, roll the segment intro. So why is the contextual storytelling so good in Firewatch in comparison to other choice-based adventure games? To answer this, we are going to have to look at the story more in depth. As I don't want to recap the whole game, making this video far too long, I am going to be specifically talking about the sections which I found interesting based on the context that the choices give the player. If you haven't played Firewatch yet and would like to try it without spoilers, this would be the time to mute the video, leave it on though, don't click off, because that hurts my ego, and go play it. The game begins with the text-based segment that we have already discussed regarding the choices of Henry's dog and Henry's drinking. The setting is a bar in Boulder, Colorado in 1975. The first quote-unquote choice of the game is a single prompt saying, "You see Julia." This is a not-so-subtle way to ease the player into the shoes of Henry, our protagonist. In fact, every single prompt in this beginning section is about you. Henry and Julia are described to be in their 20s. Henry goes up to Julia and introduces himself, and a week later the two start to date. The scene is abruptly interrupted with Henry in an elevator. We don't know when this happens, but as we have already issued a spoiler warning, I can tell you that this occurs years after Henry and Julia meet. Henry exits the elevator and gets in his car. Back in the flashback, Henry moves in with Julia. Julia teaches at a college. The two drink beers out on the deck, and Henry quote-unquote drinks beer just about anywhere. This might be a subtle hint to Henry's alcoholism, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's focus. The two get a dog. As I already mentioned in the last section, the player gets to choose between a beagle and a German shepherd. In 1979, the two discuss the prospect of having children sometime. The player once again gets to voice their opinion by saying, "That would be pretty good," or "One day, why rush?" Regardless, the two get married. Back in the current timeline, Henry gets out of his car and begins his hike on the thoroughfare trailhead. In 1980, Julia comes home late from a bar. Henry and Julia fight. The player has the option to get mad or give the cold shoulder. In 1981, Julia draws Henry. The player gets to choose between a He-Man pose or a "paint me like one of your French girls" pose. In 1982, there's a festival in Boulder. A mugger threatens Henry and Julia. Bucket gets kicked while Mayhem runs away. Julia stutters, a grim early sign of what's to come. Based on the player's choice, Henry will either scare away the attacker by pretending that he has a gun or by assaulting the mugger. In 1984, Julia gets offered a job at Yale. She wants to take it. The player can't encourage this decision as Henry doesn't want to move. Therefore, Henry will either tell Julia not to take the job or to commute back and forth between Connecticut and Colorado. In 1985, Julia is sent home after having an episode at the university. She lost it on a colleague for borrowing books that were important for her research, even though she loaned said books to them just a few days prior. And Henry has the option to take Julia to a doctor or to distract her with macaroni and wine. If Henry distracts Julia, the two will forget the incident for a while. If Henry takes Julia to the doctor, she will be diagnosed with early onset dementia. In the point of view timeline, Henry sets up camp to rest for the night. He opens Julia's journal and finds a drawing of him posing from 1981. It should be noted here though that the corresponding year on the left page says that it's from March 5th, 1985. In 1987, Julia's affliction becomes worse and worse, and it starts to affect her day-to-day life. She's sent home on a permanent medical leave. Henry and Julia's home life also takes a turn. Sometimes Julia feels like a stranger to Henry. Julia's family is told this, and they begin to make trips from Australia. All the while, Julia's condition worsens. In 1988, Henry faces the option to either move Julia to 24-hour care or to take care of her by himself. If Henry locates her to a home, their friends talk about Henry behind his back. After this, Henry decides to not see his friends that often. If Henry takes care of Julia himself, the house becomes a mess and Henry doesn't have time to see his friends. He becomes embittered with the situation. In 1989, if Julia is in a home, Julia's sister Susan comes to visit her. Susan buys Henry a typewriter to express his feelings if Henry won't go see a therapist. Once again, in this scene, the player doesn't have a choice in this. Henry visits Julia less and less. Julia sometimes has difficulties recognizing Henry. Henry spots an ad in the paper for a Firewatch job. He decides to take it. If Henry decides to take care of Julia himself, he will eventually go to a bar. He can either block the door to Julia's room, trapping her inside, or to leave it unlocked, risking that she will leave. Either way, returning from the bar, Henry is stopped by a police officer and he gets a DUI. Henry tells this to his sister-in-law Susan. Julia's parents travel from Australia and inform him that they are taking Julia with them. Henry doesn't argue. He spots an ad in the paper for a Firewatch job. He decides to take it. Either way, Henry's hike finally ends with him arriving at his lookout tower. This opening is a gut punch. There's no other way to say it. It's a feat of storytelling to start a game with a segment that doesn't have any visuals that correspond to the text and still make it as emotional as it is in Firewatch. I apologize if this is a low-hanging fruit, but the opening of Firewatch seems very similar to the film Up from 2009, as that film also begins with a small love story that ends quite sadly and forms a lasting impression on the protagonist. Anyway, the depiction of Henry and Julia's relationship is realistic. The scene in which Julia arrives home late from the bar and Henry pouts seems especially real, as I have lived through that exact situation in my life. Firewatch doesn't shy away from showing the fights, the disagreements, and the traumas of a relationship. Firewatch does, of course, show the good times also, those matter just as much as the bad times. This creates a depiction of a relationship that really feels authentic to real life, which is also why Julia's affliction seems so tragic. If the player was only hit with the good moments from the relationship before Julia's diagnosis, it would come off as manipulative from the writers. So I'm really glad that they didn't do that. The opening also works as a small example of how choice will be factored into the narrative of the game. Choosing mayhem doesn't prevent the mugging, just like telling Delilah to stay at the end of the game doesn't lead to her waiting for Henry. Sorry to hit you with the cold water there. This will be the last time I say this, I promise. The events of the game are predetermined. However, the path that Henry takes from the point that he meets Julia to the point in which he set out for the thoroughfare hike can differ a lot. And it's not just about what kind of a dog Henry can have. It's also about what kind of a person Henry is in his relationship. It's about the very reason Henry decides to take the Firewatch job. Based on the player's choices and interpretations of said choices, Henry can either be cunning, violent, petty, selfish, overprotective, loving, straightforward. I've already spent too much time describing how the player can roleplay as the character of Henry, but it should be noted as well that these blanks have to be filled in by the player. Your interpretation of Henry beating a mugger's face in might be different from mine. For you, it might have just been an act of self-defense, which is a viable reading. However, you can also read Henry as a violent person. For example, he could throw the radio into the lake later in the narrative. The last tidbit that I want to mention from the prologue is the fact that the circumstances for Henry taking the Firewatch job and leaving for Shoshone can change upon the player's choice. The choice in question is to either place Julia in 24-hour care or to take care of her by yourself. In the scenario in which Julia is placed in a home, Henry takes the job to distance himself from Julia, who has trouble remembering him. He's escaping the awful feelings that he experiences seeing the love of his life wilt away. If Henry decided to take care of Julia himself, however, the situation is very different. Henry gets a DUI and tells his sister-in-law Susan. After this, Julia's family comes out from Australia and takes Julia with them. So it is implied that Susan told the family that Henry got a DUI, and that once they saw the condition in which their daughter was living in, they decided that Henry was unfit for taking care of Julia. So when you think about it, one version of Henry is in the Shoshone to deal with the drama of his lover falling ill, and another version of Henry is there to deal with the fact that he failed to take care of Julia. I'd imagine that the second version of Henry feels a lot of shame about this whole incident, which is why he would also be ashamed of the DUI. But let's put a pin in this and return to it in the next section.
So, what's wrong with you?
Excuse me?
People take this job to get away from something. So, what's wrong?
What's wrong with you?
That's a great idea. Go ahead.
When you think about it, there are also two versions of Julia in this prologue. One ends up in a home in Boulder, and the other one is taken in by her family and back to Australia. The prologue is relatively short, so I was able to describe most of the events in it. The actual narrative, starting from Henry arriving in the Shoshone to him leaving or being left behind, if you decide to go down that route, is much longer. Considering that this video is already 30 minutes long and it's about a game that is about as relevant as talking about the 2016 Ghostbusters adaptation, I'm not going to go through every nook and cranny of this narrative. Don't get me wrong though, I would love to spend the next hour analyzing every single choice of dialogue Henry can make and how that affects the narrative, but we simply don't have the clout on this channel to make it appear in the searches. Thanks for clicking on this video, by the way, and sticking with it so far. The reason I bring this up is not to be overtly cynical, but to give a forewarning to the people who always find the one thing that I missed. I will miss stuff in this section, as covering everything would simply take too long. I still, of course, encourage you to type that one mistake in the comments. It would be rather hypocritical for me to not allow for criticism of my work when I am doing exactly that to Firewatch and its developers. I just want to emphasize that this will not be a comprehensive recap of the events of the game or possible dialogue options that are in it. So, with that said, let's begin. Henry arrives at night to his watchtower. He enters and immediately gets a call from Delilah.
Hello, Two Forks Tower.
This first interaction shows just how great the dialogue is in this game. As I have already mentioned, this is the bread and butter of Firewatch. In my dry analysis so far, I've neglected to express how freaking funny Firewatch is. Like seriously, the dry, sarcastic humor in this game really hits my funny bone.
Okay, good night, bye.
Let's see. I don't know anything about you, but maybe you just really like trees. Maybe it's a borderline fetish. A tree fetish.
Good night.
Good night. Welcome to the job.
After this, the narrative is split into separate days. Day 1. Henry writes on his typewriter. Delilah and him chat for a moment. All of a sudden, Delilah spots rockets. She commands Henry to find the people responsible. Henry loots ropes and goes down a hill. He falls. Henry gets up and keeps tracking. He finds a small campsite with a bunch of empty beer cans thrown around. He also finds an open fire and a whiskey bottle. Henry investigates further. He finds women's undergarments. He reports this to Delilah. Everyone should do this, by the way, because it's pretty funny.
There are, panties?
There are what?
I don't want to say that word again.
Why, 'cause you're 12?
Henry finds the two culprits skinny dipping. These are Chelsea and Lily. The two mock Henry. Henry responds and can even optionally throw the teen's boombox into the lake. With that done, Henry begins his hike back towards his watchtower. Delilah reveals that she was drunk while calling Henry yesterday. On the way back to his tower, Henry goes through a cave. He finds a locked gate, which leads further into the mines. After pounding on it, he leaves. He spots a figure shining a flashlight towards him. When Henry reaches his watchtower, he notices that his typewriter is lying on the ground. I really love how the music changes immediately in this scene to indicate that something is off.
Fuck me.
Henry climbs the stairs and notices that his window has been broken, his bedsheets have been stolen, and his cupboards have been ransacked. Delilah puts in a call about the incident. The player can make an educated guess about who has done the vandalism, the primary suspects being the girls at the lake or the guy in the canyon. Although, admittedly, it's fairly obvious that it's not the girls, as they couldn't have reached the tower before Henry. Day 2. Henry enjoys a cup of coffee at his desk. A neat little detail in this game is the pages that Henry types corresponding to each day. The page for the second day, for example, describes how Henry has nightmares that have Julia in them. Anyway, Delilah contacts Henry and informs him that the phone lines have been knocked down by a storm. Another neat detail in this scene is that if Henry doesn't ask for any directions during the first day and hikes to his watchtower without Delilah's help, but asks for directions on the second day, Delilah will assume that Henry went through the cave.
Okay, I can do that. Where is it?
You probably had to hike through a cave yesterday to get home.
Yeah, I did.
So you're gonna want to go back there, go through it, and keep going straight to the north when you come out.
During his hike, Delilah gets a call from someone else.
Hoping it warms up.
Heyo. I don't think so. Why, have you? Okay, good. No, I don't think he has any idea. I'm absolutely sure. Would you? All right, I'll let you know if anything changes in that regard.
I am not 100% sure what actually triggers this event, as this happened during different times in my other playthroughs. Regardless, Henry can either continue the conversation he had with Delilah or to directly question her. If Henry questions Delilah and claims that Delilah was talking about him, Delilah will get angry and ignore Henry for a while. There's even a little pop-up noting that Delilah is pissed. Very similar to the "Kenny will remember this" prompt in The Walking Dead. Delilah doesn't stay pissed that long though. After like 60 seconds you can report finding the rock slide and she'll be totally fine again. Henry hikes to the utility poles and he finds that the wire hasn't been knocked down due to a storm, it has actually been vandalized. Next to the cut wire are undergarments that have a drawing of a ranger and the text "Go to hell." Henry reports this to Delilah. Delilah is frustrated and tells Henry to go find the girls. Delilah suggests that Henry should scare the girls by wrecking their camp. During my stream in which I avoided talking to Delilah, I chose not to report the cut wire to her. The game actually reacts to this. Okay, what if I just go to the girls straight away? Let's see what happens.
I think I just saw you at the top of Beartooth Point. Was everything okay up there?
Interesting. No, Henry! Why would you say that?
Calling card.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm gonna go find him.
Well, good. And also, why don't you call me the next time you find something like that?
And I'm not gonna lie, I was very surprised to find out that the game had actually prepared for this possibility. And I have to give credit where credit is due, this is very cool. It's actually funny, because Delilah can become pissed at you right before you find the wire and say that she doesn't want to talk to Henry. So, being the role player that I am, I didn't contact her when I found the cut wire. This leads to the same scene, but she was even more pissed. So I gotta ask, like, what do you want, Delilah? Like, should I report things to you, or should I stay silent? Make up your goddamn mind. Okay. Henry finds an abandoned backpack belonging to Brian Goodwin. Inside the backpack, he finds a disposable camera and sturdier ropes. It should be noted that the cliff above the backpack has ropes hanging off it. We'll return to this. Henry mentions that the backpack belongs to Brian Goodwin, and Delilah seems surprised. Delilah explains that Brian was a kid stationed at Two Forks with his father Ned Goodwin. Delilah also mentions that this wasn't exactly allowed, but she isn't a stickler for rules. Ned and Brian suddenly departed from Two Forks in the middle of their summer. Delilah asks Henry about his current relationship status. Henry can tell Delilah that he is married, lie that he doesn't have anyone, or to avoid the topic completely. These dialogue options are actually choices which have very interesting outcomes. It might come as a surprise, but you can actually play through Firewatch without ever telling Delilah about Julia. And not even in the lie that you have no one way, you can literally avoid the topic entirely, and at the end of the game, Delilah will not be able to tell Henry to go back to Julia, which happens in most playthroughs, I would suspect. Delilah will prod more, but if the player sticks to not telling her anything, she will never find out. This dialogue is also the first indication of the relationship that is starting to form between Henry and Delilah. It will become much more flirtatious if the player chooses to go down that path. Henry finds the teens' campsite. Only problem is that their tent has been ripped open and their clothes have been spread around. Henry finds a note on the tent written by Lily and Chelsea in which they blame Henry for destroying their campsite. The teens also mention that Henry has stolen their panties, which, has some very concerning implications once you know who actually did this. Henry reports the note to Delilah. Henry can either tell the truth about the contents of the note, or to lie that it was an apology for all the trouble. Day 3. Henry fixes the broken window in his lookout. This is the scene in which Delilah asks questions about Henry's appearance, which we already went through in an earlier section, so I won't spend any more time on it here. However, the player can actually discover Henry's notes about this day. On this day's notes, Henry recalls getting a call from Julia's father, Mick. He also ponders that Julia got the parts that he likes from Mick and the parts that he was afraid of from Julia's mother, Madeline. Day 9. Henry eats a sandwich overlooking an amazing sunset view. Delilah calls and informs him that Chelsea and Lily have been reported missing and that Henry is the last person that has seen them. Delilah asks Henry if they should report their sightings of the teens to the authorities. Henry can imply that he would like to tell the authorities, and Delilah will agree with this, but she will never actually inform them. Henry can also say that it shouldn't be reported, to which Delilah agrees. Day 15. Henry wakes up in the middle of the night to Delilah's call. Answering the radio, Delilah's voice suddenly changes to Julia's. Henry is dreaming. Julia asks if Henry is having a nice time. She also remarks that
Delilah seems nice.
Let's pause here. This little lilt in Julia's dialogue is perfect. I don't know if I'm projecting onto this performance, but it does seem that the implication behind the statement is to inquire if Henry is cheating on Julia. Considering that this was a dream sequence and that Henry has already written about having nightmares with Julia in them, it would seem that Henry's affection towards Delilah is gnawing at his guilt-ridden subconscious. The notes of this day are Henry's reflections on how much fun he is having with Delilah, once again echoing the guilt that he feels over coming to the Shoshone. Day 33. Henry hikes to retrieve supplies for his tower. Delilah mentioned that she heard Henry talk into the walkie-talkie a while back in his sleep. The replies that are available for the player to choose from changed based upon whether Delilah knows about Julia or not. Delilah tells about her ex called Javier. The reason for Delilah saying this also changes based on if the player has told Delilah about Julia or not. If Delilah is aware of Julia, she says that Henry has told so much about himself that she should do that also. However, if Henry hasn't told her about Julia, she will do so saying, "You haven't told me anything about you and that's okay, but there you go, there's a whole lot about me." If the player doesn't choose any of the dialogue options, Delilah will not tell Henry about her ex. I would like to pause here and just acknowledge how much of the character building in this game actually depends on the choices that the player makes. If you don't interact with Delilah in this scene, you won't get this backstory. Henry grabs his own supplies and heads off. Optionally, the player can also grab other people's supplies and throw them off a cliff or something. This will result in Day 34 is a day that only occurs if the player takes other people's supplies. It's a funny, it's a haha, not much to analyze here to be honest. Day 64. Henry and Delilah watch the fire burn. Delilah tells Henry that she usually stores a bottle in the nearby creek and gets it on hot days. Based on the player's previous choices, Delilah can become very flirtatious during this scene. If the player doesn't respond, Delilah doesn't share what they could do if they were together. This day is the one that defines the relationship between the two. If Henry and Delilah flirt, their romance will ripple through the narrative. If they don't, the two will still have a buddy relationship, but it won't be romantically inclined. Day 76. This is the day that the narrative picks up its pace. Henry goes to fish. He finds a mysterious clipboard. Someone has written down conversations that Delilah and Henry had over the walkie-talkies. A strange noise is heard nearby. Henry investigates and finds a red walkie-talkie. Suddenly, someone whacks Henry over the noggin, and he loses consciousness. Henry wakes up to Delilah's alarmed calls. Henry tells her about what happened and about the clipboard. By the way, the player can attempt to hide the clipboard, but someone will always find it and take it back. The clipboard said Wapiti Station, so Henry goes out and investigates Wapiti Meadow. He is blocked off, however, by a chain link fence. Delilah suggests that he should retrieve a fire axe to get through. Henry hikes to the last known location of the firefighters in the park. On the way, Delilah and Henry discuss the implications of someone hostile being in the park with them. Henry can also bring up the idea that someone might be listening in on their conversations. Henry discovers an odd location where 2 snowmobiles have been abandoned. He also finds a small pond. The sign of Pork Pond has been stolen. Henry finds the Pulaski and starts to head back towards the chain link fence. All of a sudden, a third person coughs over the walkie-talkies.
Did you just cough?
No. Did you just cough?
No.
Henry and Delilah are shocked, and the day ends. Day 77. Henry awaits Delilah to contact him. Through a bit of trickery, Henry realizes that he has to go to Cottonwood. There, in a stash box, he finds a second walkie-talkie. Henry and Delilah, understandably, freak out about the situation. Delilah urges Henry to break in through the chain link fence and discover what is going on at the Wapiti station. Henry can become very suspicious of Delilah during the scene, implying that she is tricking him. Alternatively, Henry can start to think that he is literally losing his mind just like Julia.
Maybe you're not real. Maybe I'm losing my mind.
What?
Like Julia. And maybe it's happening to me, and I'm imagining that I have a boss out here and that we're being spied on.
Henry.
Maybe there was something in the water, or our condo was underneath some power lines, and you, Delilah, you're not real.
Henry, think about her. If what happened to her were happening to you, you wouldn't even be able to realize it.
Okay.
Henry, sweetie, I am real and this is happening. I'm as real as the sky is blue. Take a second and then call me back. I'm on your side.
But before that, I would like to note a very cool detail here. During the preceding days, Henry can discover a route that would allow him to leave. Only that path has been blocked by a landslide. Henry comments that this is the way that he came, but that isn't true as he came from the opposite direction on the first night. Maybe a bit of an oversight, I don't know. If this landslide is discovered on an earlier day, Henry will comment about it and Delilah will just note that it is a common occurrence. If this is discovered after Henry is knocked out, Henry will say that this is an emergency and he needs to leave.
Emergency.
I'm sensing an emergency.
I can't call and ask for a $15,000 helicopter ride because there might be someone out here harassing us.
Well, let me know when you can, okay?
If this is discovered on a day when Henry and Delilah know that someone is listening to them, Henry can actually make the claim that someone did this on purpose.
Is it possible that someone caused the rock slide and took out the path?
No, that's crazy.
As crazy as our radios being tapped?
Look, if we start thinking every single thing that happens to us is them, we'll go nuts.
Maybe that's part of their plan.
And this is the exact moment when I realized that I hadn't given Firewatch's choice enough credit. My assumption was that the game would simply react to this landslide like it would on every other day. Does this change anything in the narrative? Of course not, because... oh right, I can't say that anymore. The prevents are determined. Despite this, I can't deny how cool this is. There are 3 different dialogue options designed just for this small detail that most people won't probably even discover. Just like the earlier mention of the "don't report the cut wire" example, I am thoroughly surprised how much time the developers spent on these small details. And speaking of small details, if you go and find the old Shoshone tape now, Delilah will comment,
Do you think it could be anything like the tape you have of us?
No, it's definitely not. It's just music. Don't worry.
Well, if it's the new Milli Vanilli, it could be just as incriminating.
even though we haven't even received the incriminating tape yet. I think this is a small oversight, but I found it kind of funny. It's a bummer though that the player can't listen to the tape now though. Anyway, Henry checks to the chain link fence. He breaks the lock. If the player chooses to interact with this box, Henry will be stung by a bee. This can then be reported to Delilah, who will be rather indifferent to Henry's report. This shows just how much the context for these events has changed. Being stung by a bee would have been a riot during the first few days, but now it's not even worth reporting to Delilah. Similarly, once Henry has been knocked out, the player can report the turtle to Delilah, which is a kind of a bummer. Henry crosses a chasm. He heads down to the valley. There he finds all sorts of advanced technology, a small sample collecting area, and a tent. There's a very weird detail here. One of the videos that I watched as background research for this was Geek Remix's video on Firewatch. The link is in the description, by the way. In the video, she notes the following.
She can see Henry walking around way the butts across the map, but has no idea what is going on in the area that is much closer. She can perfectly see the setup in Wapiti from her lookout. Look, she can see us perfectly well walking around at Wapiti, meaning that she could have been able to see Ned set up that camp and see the fence. So she says she doesn't know anything about Wapiti Station, and yet it's closer to her than Two Pines, and she can see it.
Now, this was incredibly convincing, so I went to check my footage and noticed that in my gameplay, the thoroughfare tower definitely wasn't visible from Wapiti Station. I went to, of course, check the patch notes for the game, but none of them mentioned adding trees to this area. Admittedly, I might have missed it, but this is very weird regardless. The conspiracies are bursting out of the game itself. Henry goes into the tent where he finds a bunch of stuff. He finds a wave receiver which he grabs. The wave receiver starts to beep and Henry follows it. There's a map showing movements of something. Henry immediately realizes that these are his movements. There's a hint next to the map indicating that they are probably not tracking Henry, but apparently he doesn't spot this. It should also be noted that these definitely aren't Henry's movements because they don't resemble the routes that we take as him. There's also a very funny detail in this scene in which Henry recognizes one of the devices as an earthquake monitor, but when Delilah thinks it's a lie detector, the description of said box changes. On the table, he finds a small box to which the wave receiver corresponds to. Underneath that, he finds the unspeakable, a folder with notes about Henry and Delilah, stuff they haven't shared with each other. Henry reports this to Delilah, who is understandably shocked by this discovery. Delilah, giving into her anger, suggests that Henry should burn the campsite. The player has the choice to answer in a few different ways, and oh boy, does this have an interesting outcome. Anyway, Henry doesn't set the site on fire. You don't have the choice in that aspect. Henry just isn't an arsonist. Henry leaves and a part of the chasm breaks from his jump. Henry can't access this side anymore. Henry notices that the side has been set aflame. Henry can report this to Delilah or to keep silent. It doesn't really matter as Delilah will spot the fire anyways. Delilah will immediately be furious because she assumes that Henry set the campsite on fire even though he didn't.
Jesus, okay, yeah, I see it.
What the hell happened to you? It's definitely not the best idea.
It wasn't me.
This can be protested, but the funniest way to respond to this, without a doubt, is by staying silent.
Calm down, Delilah. That's crazy. Of course he didn't do that. He wouldn't do that. Would he, Henry?
This is very interesting.
The hell do I do?
This will lead to Delilah assuming that Henry definitely did this. The scene is cut off, but the day doesn't change. It is now night, and Henry wakes up to his wave receiver beeping. Many have also noted that this is the point in the game that Henry takes off his wedding ring. It is clear that Henry is now fully on board with this conspiracy that he has unraveled, and he isn't thinking about Julia anymore. Henry follows the signal of the wave receiver while also talking with Delilah. Delilah has decided to get drunk. It's actually neat because she tells Henry that she likes to store alcohol during the 64th day, and now she has retrieved that very bottle from the creek. Henry finds the source of the signal. He finds a backpack with a key attached to it. As he grabs it, an alarm bell goes off. Henry can smash it or leave it be, doesn't really matter. Henry grabs the backpack and begins to backtrack. All of a sudden, Delilah comments that Henry has already returned to his tower, even though he hasn't. Henry runs towards the tower, but he is already too late. The culprit has left. This means that the alarm was a signal for the culprit to enter the tower, knowing that Henry wouldn't be there. Henry goes to his tower and he finds a Walkman duct taped to his door. He listens to the tape inside. What is said on the tape is based on the player's choice earlier in the valley when Delilah wanted to burn the campsite down. The tape's contents are Henry and Delilah talking, doctored to sound like they had every intention to burn the campsite down. It should be noted, however, that if Henry decided to stay quiet during this part, the tape will only implicate Delilah rather than both of them. So that's a big win for my guy, Big H. Henry reports the contents of the tape to Delilah. The day ends. Day 78. This day begins with Henry listening to the tape again. With nothing else left to do, Henry and Delilah decide that they should go explore the nearby cave, now having the key to the locked gate within. This is also to gather evidence on the culprit. Before Henry goes to the cave, Delilah informs him that someone called Another Sector's Lookout impersonating Henry and claiming that Delilah knew what caused the Wapiti Meadow fire. This causes Delilah to momentarily suspect Henry.
Hey, you didn't actually make that call, right? To the other lookout? It just stuck in my craw. I let myself imagine how fucked I would be if you'd been lying to me. But now that I asked, I kinda just wish I hadn't.
Henry heads to the cave, opens the locked door, and enters. After taking 10 paces, the door suddenly is closed and locked again. There's a very cool detail here. If you actually watch close enough, you can see the perpetrator close it here. No, I'm just kidding. The wind blows it closed and a ghost locks it. That's so stupid. I'm so sorry. Henry goes deeper into the cave. He can't contact Delilah as the cave doesn't have reception. He finds a mysterious shoe down in the caves. Henry yells to check if anyone is down there. No one replies. Henry gets out of the cave from another exit. He informs Delilah about what happened. Henry explores a bit and finds a small cliffside nook. There he finds a bunch of nerdy stuff. This is nerdy because it's the 80s, by the way. Like a D&D character sheet, a cave painting that depicts a castle and a dragon, homework. Oh my god, yeah, that's so nerdy. He's doing homework. And a plan to retrieve the backpack that Henry found earlier. This is Brian Goodwin's hangout spot. Only, it's very strange that all these items have been left behind. Henry also finds climbing anchors which allow him to descend deeper into the cave. As Henry doesn't have any other way out, he does this exactly. Before that, however, Delilah informs Henry that the two missing teenagers have been found. Nothing sinister was at play.
Those girls turned up. Looks like you didn't kill them. Nobody did. They took some farmer's tractor for a joyride down in Riverton and, landed in jail.
Damn it.
At the bottom of the cave, Henry finds Brian's corpse.
Oh, God. You're Brian Goodwin. You fell. Your stuff gave out. Oh, you poor kid.
This was a surprisingly emotional moment that I honestly didn't see coming. The accompanying music is very somber and unlike the other tracks in the game. It's also a neat touch that Henry can't walk over the body. Approaching the body activates an animation in which he steps over it. Although, if you do this later in the game, you can step over it as much as you want. Where were we? Oh right, it's also a very neat touch that the shoe we discovered earlier is right above Brian's body. Henry exits the cave and informs Delilah about what happened. Delilah is shocked. Henry can make the claim in the scene that the people listening on them were the ones actually behind Brian's death. Delilah responds like this.
Can we just put this stupid shit aside for a minute? That boy is dead. He was just a sweet kid. They didn't kill him, okay? Why kill a boy?
I don't know.
The day ends. This marks the ending for the fun conspiracy plotline. There's a dead boy involved and things have gotten a lot more serious. With that, we start the final day. Day 79. Henry packs all of his items. The forest fire has become uncontrollable and the lookouts are being evacuated. The wave receiver starts to beep again. Henry informs Delilah that he is going to go after the signal. At this point, Delilah seems like she doesn't really care. The revelation of Brian's demise has fundamentally grounded her in the bleak reality where she failed to inform the authorities about his presence in the lookout with Ned. Henry hikes to the source of the signal. He finds a collar similar to the one found on the dead elk and the name Henry written in paint. There's also a rope leading up the slope and attached to it is a tape. Henry takes it and listens to it. In the tape, Ned Goodwin, Brian's father, reveals the events of the game. How he has been living in the Shoshone for the last 3 years, how Henry saw him in the canyon, how he has been listening to Henry and Delilah's conversations because Delilah is a record you don't gotta flip, and how he didn't kill Brian. Henry climbs the slope and finds Ned Goodwin's hideout. He reports about the contents of the tape to Delilah. Delilah immediately believes that Ned killed Brian. Henry finds various things in the hideout, for example the teen magazines, the remnants of a boombox, a D&D playbook, and notes entailing the events of the game from Ned's perspective. He has even written down things that he should do to distract Henry and Delilah. Ned was the one to sever the wire at the utility poles. He was the one who wrote the reports at the Wapiti station, the drafts of which the player can find in this hideout. He was also the one to record Delilah and Henry's communication at the Wapiti station. The final note mentions that 2F, that's Henry by the way, found supplies, key gone, can let 2F find Brian. Henry leaves the hideout. Delilah calls and comments how she should feel relieved that there wasn't a grand conspiracy, but she's not. She's very broken about Brian's death. The player can either say that Brian's death was an accident, Ned loved him, or that he wasn't a very good dad. Delilah also mentions that she can't stop thinking about the fact that she could have sent Brian home. She contemplates if she should tell people about the corpse. If she does, she will be further interrogated. Delilah informs Henry that the rescue helicopter has arrived to retrieve her. Henry can either plead her to wait for him or urge her to go. If Henry pleads her to stay, she promises to do so. And as a side note, by the way, I went to check if Brian's body was still in the cave when Henry is about to be evacuated, and yes, it's still there. Ned really doesn't care about burying Brian. Henry hikes to Delilah's tower. It felt surreal to finally see the place where Delilah has been this entire game. It was also very exciting to finally meet Delilah. Except, when Henry reaches the lookout, Delilah has already left. This happens no matter what the player chooses, by the way. It's cool to see all the little details that have been alluded to earlier in the game. There's the drawing that Delilah drew of Henry, the crosswords magazine that she was filling when Henry found the raccoon, the pork pond sign that was stolen, the empty tequila bottle, this weird drawing of a moose with a beard. Okay, the last one is just random. Henry sits down at the desk and puts on Delilah's headsets. She is at the other end. Delilah mentions that the helicopter will be at Henry's location shortly. She also mentions that there's going to be a debrief with lots of questions. Delilah laments that she will not be able to come to the job next summer. The two take turns deciding what each should do next. This is a very neat full circle moment, as it reflects the first communication that the two had. Henry can suggest that Delilah should come to Boulder with him, to move to Santa Fe, or to become a therapist. What Delilah suggests changes based upon if Henry has told Delilah about Julia and what he decides now. Henry's suggestion of coming to Boulder with him will always be shut down. If Delilah knows about Julia, she will suggest that Henry should go see her. She also suggests to put his typewriter to good use. If Delilah doesn't know about Julia, she will just suggest that Henry should write. Henry spots the helicopter, the two wish each other good luck. The player is faced with the final choice of the game, although this is not telegraphed to the player at all. Henry can go to the chopper and go home. Alternatively, if Henry dawdles long enough, the chopper will take off without him. The end credits roll and the photos that the player has taken are displayed. At the end is the selfie that Henry takes accidentally, then a photo of a tow dino attacking Two Forks Tower, a toy which can be found in the game by the way, a photo of Ned Goodwin, a selfie of Brian Goodwin, and finally Ned and Brian sitting on the stairs of the Two Forks lookout. And that's the game. Now, let's analyze. Remember when I talked about choices for 12 minutes or so? Well, there was an actual point to that. Firewatch is a narrative that is difficult to critique because it deliberately leaves the character building of Henry to the player. I don't often talk about the way that games can be played wrong, but staying silent for the whole duration of the game is definitely not the best experience that Firewatch can offer. So when critiquing a narrative that is supposed to react to the player's choices, it becomes immensely difficult to pinpoint any meaningful character development because your Henry might be different from mine. If I say that Henry is in the Shoshone to repent for not taking care of Julia well enough, you can just say that Henry actually put Julia in a home and he is there because he is afraid to visit her. We have conflicting notions about what actually happened in the narrative itself. The events stay the same, but the context for said events changes. It's like the developers looked at The Walking Dead and balked at the players who went through the game thinking about the optimal choices rather than living through Lee Everett's experience. The choices aren't there to give you a unique experience by changing the story. They are there to make you live through the mystery as Henry. In this way, Firewatch manages to become a narrative that is about its protagonist, rather than the events that happen around him. Firewatch is a narrative that is built around 3 plotlines: the prologue, the relationship between Henry and Delilah, and a central mystery. The relationship is the heartbeat of the narrative. It's always there in the dialogue. This is the thing that I remember most fondly about the game whenever I think back on it. The mystery plotline feels like the direct opposite. It's about people listening in on the conversations that we have. It's about being isolated and having no means of escape. It's about a death of a child and a man who is so ashamed of his mistakes that he goes to incredible lengths to hide the truth. We begin with the warm, fuzzy depiction of Henry befriending Delilah and the two potentially becoming romantically involved. By the way, I'm just gonna be calling this a relationship from now on, so interpret that however you may. The comedy is largely born from Delilah's personality. She is a very lighthearted person and employs a very dry, sarcastic style of humor. The first night and day in the Shoshone is just banter between Henry and Delilah until the vandalism in the lookout occurs. But even after that, the narrative still feels very lighthearted. We track down the pesky teenagers who vandalized the phone line and the narrative just feels fun. There's nothing all that serious going on, just a grumpy old lookout battling against two rebellious teenagers. That is, until we find the destroyed tent. Considering that this feels very close to a scene from an 80s slasher film, it's okay to feel like this turn of events comes out of left field. Now, we of course know that it wasn't Jason Voorhees or a bear that did this, it was actually Ned Goodwin. What makes this scene even creepier is the fact that Ned stole the teen's panties. I know that these are found earlier at the top of Beartooth Point, but still, why did you take the panties, Ned? It's just very creepy. Like, why couldn't he have used a shirt or a coat or something? Nah. I need the panties. Despite all of this, the lightheartedness still returns to the narrative. Delilah questions Henry about his appearance. Henry enjoys a sandwich. Delilah tells that the teens have been reported missing. Even though in this moment the mystery rears its head, we still return to some sense of normalcy. Henry wakes up in the middle of night to Julia's call. This is a way to tie the relationship between Henry and Delilah to the prologue and to remind the player that even though Henry has escaped the events of the prologue, they still affect him deeply. Henry fetches supplies. This scene elaborates on Delilah's background and the prologue starts to become more and more intertwined with their relationship. The relationship comes to a particular focus on day 64 as Henry and Delilah watch the fire. At this point, I'd argue that the plot could have either leaned more heavily on the relationship between Henry and Delilah or dived deeper into the mystery that has been rearing its head momentarily. As we know, of course, the emphasis is on the latter. Day 76 is the day that the mystery plotline finally boils over. Henry finds the clipboard and is attacked. From this point on, there is no putting the genie back in the bottle. The prologue and the relationship plotlines fade into the background as the mystery takes the spotlight. As I have already mentioned, the mood and the tone of the narrative changes completely. But before we progress further from that statement, let's look at what actually happened in the narrative. So at this point in the game, Henry has found Ned in the ravine. Before this, he vandalized Henry's tower, stealing supplies and Henry's sheets. We now know that this was simply because he was stocking up for winter. As Henry reports seeing him to Delilah, she calls for a hiker's list. By the way, this happens even if Henry doesn't reply anything. Delilah will always call for the hiker's list, so this makes sense. This forces Ned to sabotage the phone lines, which he also smartly sets up to look like it was done by the teens. Ned's assumption is that Delilah will just forget to ask for the hiker's list after the lines have been sabotaged, and to my surprise, this actually works. Delilah does genuinely forget. Ned also tears up the teens' tent. He smartly leaves Henry's bed sheets at the camp after the teens have left. I think Ned did this for a few reasons. First, he needs to get rid of the teens so that Henry and the teens can compare notes. Secondly, if Ned manages to trick the teens to believe that Henry tore through their camp, he can use the information to blackmail Henry. Thirdly, he needs to get the teens loot to plant at the phone line, and he needed to plant Henry's sheets at the campsite. Let's pause here and just acknowledge how well this is set up as a mystery. Ned is this brilliant agent of chaos who manages to nudge the teens and Henry against each other. And then we get the clipboard. I understand that Ned was collecting notes about Henry and Delilah just to remember it all and in case he needed to blackmail them. But why is this clipboard here? Did he come to fish and as Henry approached he jumped into a bush forgetting the clipboard? If that's the case, then that's awfully inconvenient for a person that has been shown to be very crafty before. And then there's the walkie-talkie. Did Ned plant this for Henry to find so that he could whack him with the stick? It should be acknowledged that it is shown that Ned is very handy with technology, and he would know that Henry coming closer to the walkie-talkie with the button pressed down could cause a feedback loop. So I'll definitely buy that Ned should be able to do this. However, Ned jumping out of the bush just to do this fast, and then jumping back into the bushes, finding a bunking stick, and then whacking Henry is just a bit much. I mean, maybe he feels cornered and this is the last line of defense that he has, but then again, it does seem very convenient for the plot. Anyway, Henry now knows for certain that there is someone in the woods that could attack him. It's a smart choice to have Delilah initially doubt Henry. This is a red herring in itself. It gives the impression that Delilah might be in on this. She, however, urges Henry to bust into the Wapiti station. Before Henry can do this, Ned coughs over the radio, and here we go again. Why does this happen? Does Ned accidentally hold down the button while holding the walkie-talkie? Is he deliberately leading Henry and Delilah to suspect that someone is listening to them so that they will eventually go to the Wapiti station? I can't figure this one out. If it's just an accident, then that's terrible. Anyway, the date changes, and during this time, Delilah hikes to Cottonwood to give Henry the new walkie-talkie. She doesn't come to Henry because that would clearly indicate to whoever is listening that they have swapped walkie-talkies. Many, however, have pointed this out as suspicious on Delilah's part. I don't get this viewpoint. Delilah can't just walk to the tower and hand Henry a new walkie-talkie because then Ned would immediately know what's up. I know that Delilah's plan doesn't work either way, but there wasn't any way that she could have known that Ned was going to just listen in on the new walkie-talkie as well. What doesn't work is that Henry can't cross the chasm to Delilah's tower at this point because it's not an emergency.
At the ravine, it kind of feels like what we're dealing with out here is an emergency. Well, wouldn't you say this is an emergency? I mean, how have we not buddied up in the past couple of days?
Because I didn't think that was a good idea.
Delilah, come on.
Do you really blame me?
What about me? I am the one actually going through this stuff.
And I'm a woman out in the woods, and they don't let us keep guns.
Jesus, Delilah.
Oh, come on, don't give me crap for feeling safer over here by myself, all right?
Fine.
Look, that fire is burning out of control, so if you're yearning for a rickety ride on an old tram, you might just get your wish.
I think this particular detail is far more suspicious on Delilah's part. During the time that Delilah sneaked the walkie-talkie and Henry awaited for the call, Ned wrote fake surveillance reports about Delilah and Henry. Ned's endgame notes reflect that Henry and Delilah suspecting a conspiracy was funny to Ned, so he decided to lean into it. The game doesn't explain how he had this information, but I guess Ned had a habit of tapping into different frequencies and listening in. Anyway, Ned sneaks into the Wapiti station, turns on the wave receiver, and plants the fake documents under a tracker to ensure that Henry will find them. This site is empty because the researchers have been evacuated due to the forest fire. This can be discerned from two different documents that Henry discovers. Ned's plan succeeds. Delilah becomes enraged and urges Henry to burn the site down. Ned, now knowing that he has a second opportunity to blackmail the two, records the conversation and burns the site down as Henry leaves. How Ned can scrape together a recording device and make multiple tapes is up for the player to imagine. It feels like a bit of a reach for me personally, but nothing that really breaks the narrative completely. During the same night, Ned decides that he's going to give one of the tapes to Henry just to show that he means business. He does this by luring Henry out with the wave receiver and attaching a noisemaker to it. No, wait, that's an alien isolation thing. An alarm, whatever. What I don't understand is why he leaves his supplies and the key to the cave where Brian died. Once again, this just feels a tad too convenient for the narrative. I would like to reiterate, he writes later that this wasn't supposed to happen. But I suppose the villain has to have some flaws, and it makes sense as Ned was in a rush out of there. The next day, Henry goes down to the cave, and as he enters, Ned is the one to lock the door after he enters. It wasn't a ghost, I lied, I'm sorry. I suppose the idea behind Ned's plan here is to trap Henry in the cave so that he'll die, I guess. However, considering that Ned didn't want Henry discovering Brian's body, this doesn't make much sense. In my initial playthroughs, I thought that Ned wanted Henry to discover the body because that's the only thing that explains why Ned, number one, left the keys for Henry, or number two, actually locked the gate after he went in. Anyway, Henry does discover the corpse and he does report it to Delilah. This is also the moment that the forest fire starts to spread further. Ned plants the tape for Henry to find and leaves to find a new place to hide. I really like that Brian's fate is left a bit ambiguous. Delilah definitely believes that Ned killed Brian and left him behind. Henry can be a bit more sympathetic towards Ned, and I've played this game like 6 times now, and I still can't make up my mind about what actually happened. Ned seems genuine about Brian's death being an accident. He still holds on to Brian's D&D book, a Father's Day card, and a picture of him. He has even made a note about Brian's birthday so that he wouldn't forget. But Ned is also very cunning. All of this could just be set up to garner sympathy from Henry and to avoid the law for just a moment longer. Ned is not a good guy. I've noted some of the issues that the narrative has. Ned makes 3 mistakes that eventually reveal his presence in the Shoshone. First, he leaves the clipboard for Henry to find, then he coughs over the radio on the same day, and finally, he accidentally leaves his supplies and the key to the cave for Henry to find. I've talked about these elements as mistakes so far because the text itself, mostly the notes found at the end of the game, don't make the distinction that these were intentional. The clipboard definitely isn't intentional because what would be the point of Ned revealing himself to Henry all of the sudden when he has executed his plan so far perfectly? The coughing over the radio could be intentional as Ned knows that Henry and Delilah are already suspicious about Wapiti Meadow, so he knows that he just has to distract them for a moment so that he can go and plant the faked reports about them. I can kind of buy this, but Ned being able to anticipate that Henry wouldn't go busting through the gate immediately after hearing someone cough over the radio is very convenient. Like if you're playing Angry Henry, the Destroyer of Worlds, it would make sense that he would head directly to the Wapiti station, Pulaski in hand, to question whoever was listening in on his conversations. He wouldn't wait out a night and then find out what happened. The thing is that, even though I've pointed these inconsistencies out, they don't really take away from my enjoyment of the narrative. All of them can be explained by Ned was rushing or Ned was distracted, but then again, as a mystery, I don't think these explanations are very convincing, but once again, they don't ruin the narrative for me. Villains in mysteries make mistakes. That's totally fine. We all love it when a genius detective says, "And you would have gotten away with it if it weren't for this one flaw." Oh, it's from Scooby-Doo. Well, anyway, my point stands. We all love that moment when all the different threads of the mystery combine and we are shown the grand picture of what actually happened. If the villain didn't make any mistakes, the detective would never get to the bottom of the truth. Or they would just guess the answer because they are so smart. And I know that Firewatch isn't a whodunit, so this isn't a one-to-one comparison, but I'm thinking about the genre of mystery overall. Henry isn't a detective and he really doesn't actually figure out the mystery. The grand revelation in Firewatch is the villain leaving a tape for Henry to find in which he tells what actually happened. He does this because an ulterior circumstance, the forest fire, has forced him to leave and because he wants to tell Henry what actually happened. As I've already noted, this could be because Ned wants to manipulate Henry into telling the cops that Ned wasn't responsible for Brian's fall. Or maybe he wants to just earnestly tell his side of the story that Henry doesn't think that he is a monster. We don't know which one is the truth, as it is left ambiguous deliberately. It feels weird how little I've spoken about the relationship between Delilah and Henry throughout this analysis section. As I mentioned earlier, the relationship between the two is the heartbeat of the narrative. Everything in this game comes from the way that these two feel about the events that unfold. This game would be boring if Henry didn't have anyone to talk to. If you find Delilah annoying as a character, I can guarantee that you're going to have a bad time with this game. For me personally, I really like Delilah as a character. She's a very bubbly personality, and it's tough to not start to feel for her throughout the narrative. She's written very well, and I think the performance by Cissy Jones is perfect. It's also very interesting to follow her progression. She starts out as a very easygoing character, asking Henry questions that are far too forthright for a person that she just met. It is later revealed that she was drunk during this interaction, so it kinda makes sense. There are many funny moments with Delilah.
Yeah, you're probably fine. Wait, is the lookout you're in burned to a crisp and filled with raccoons?
Apparently.
Ooh, Hawk's Rest.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're doing.
What do you mean? I just like to stay out of haunted places myself.
Okay, go on. Out with it.
You want to hear about Raccoon Carter? So, some years ago, way before my time, a man named Winthrop Carter was stationed at Hawk's Rest. He was an angry loner. The story was he lost his life savings betting on horse fights.
Horse fights?
In Mexico.
She remains bubbly until the conspiracy plotline takes over. This is when her character starts to change. She no longer makes jokes when Henry does something that could be ridiculed. This becomes even worse when Henry discovers Brian's corpse. At that point, the gravity of her mistake becomes central to her character. When Henry uncovers the mystery, she seems so done with everything that she barely reacts. This leads to her ending, which we'll cover in the next segments. But before we get there, I would like to reiterate how well the relationship between Henry and Delilah is built in Firewatch. The juxtaposition of the mystery and the relationship narratives wouldn't work if Delilah wasn't as well written and performed as she is. Most people, critics and casual players alike, will agree that the game up until this point is good, if not great. After this, however, things take a turn. Okay, it's time to talk about the most controversial part about the game. The ending. I would say that this is one of the most controversial video game endings ever, but I think Mass Effect still holds that trophy because of the sheer size of its fanbase in comparison to Firewatch. What I will say is that this ending is something that soured many people who had an otherwise great experience with the game. The three storylines that are set up from the start eventually come to conclusion. Henry can either go back to Julia, leave the Shoshone, or to stay. Henry and Delilah's relationship doesn't result in them getting together after the summer. In fact, Henry never even gets to meet Delilah, at least during the events of the game itself. The government research conspiracy ends up being just a hermit in the woods covering his tracks. There are a few common paths that the critics and the defenders of this game take. First, the critics will say that the choices didn't matter to the outcome. As I have displayed during this video, these choices actually do matter, but, and that's a very big but, in small, inconsequential, in terms of events, ways. For many people, this just wasn't enough, or it just wasn't what they expected. The defenders will often note that it's about the journey, not the destination. In this case, I fall into the defender side in this conversation as the game gave me just enough changes in the smaller details to make it worth my while. I've already noted the times that I was thoroughly surprised to see how much thought had gone into the changes that happened when playing the game as a mute, for example. The second thing that the critics will point out is that the ending is simply anticlimactic. This refers to the conspiracy just being a guy in the woods and to the H&D relationship never going anywhere. In fact, the top post of all time on our Firewatch is a text post noting this exact thing. Therefore, I would say that the critics who view the ending as anticlimactic aren't a small minority of people that had this experience with the game. Reading the newest reviews from howlongtobeat.com also echoes the fact that people who played the game recently for the first time really didn't like the ending. The idea behind this critique is that since the game introduces so many different red herrings that are more interesting than the actual ending itself, it ends up feeling anticlimactic. The teens weren't killed by a crazed killer in the woods. The people listening to Henry and Delilah weren't crazy scientists running a social experiment on people who are isolated from the rest of the world. The defenders will reply to this critique with the notion that the conspiracy plot was there as a distraction for Henry. Henry, and the player by extension, are invited to participate in this crazy conspiracy plot because it reflects the very reason Henry has decided to come to the woods. He is escaping his feelings about Julia, and when things escalate, this gives him a reason not to think about Julia so much. Like I mentioned previously, Henry taking off his wedding ring when these things happen is a clear indication of where his priorities currently lie. So a reading like this is supported by the text itself. Henry is in a very emotionally vulnerable state. Vulnerable.
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 Vulnerable. Henry is in a very emotionally vulnerable state. He can start to believe that he has the same infliction that Julia has. Henry can also be very paranoid and angry throughout the narrative, that is, if you decide to play him that way. So Henry delving this deep into a conspiracy about someone listening to him and Delilah does make sense from the point of view of his character. The game also invites you to do this by introducing a truly impressive amount of red herrings. The teens, the torn up tent, Delilah's weird conversation with someone else, the chain link fence, even the medicine wheel that the player can discover. Later at the research site, there's the bee sting, the map showing something's movements, the antennas, etc. These all serve two functions. First, to distract the player from what is actually happening, and two, present interesting directions the story could go. When Henry finds out that it was actually just Ned, a lonely hermit, listening in on the conversations, and when Henry reaches Delilah's lookout and gets rejected by her, this is meant to be the dramatic conclusion to the arc that you forgot about. The narrative was always about Henry escaping, not about the things that are happening in the Shoshone. You're supposed to get lost in the mystery only to be hit with the cold water at the end. But this doesn't change the fact that the ending was anticlimactic, right? The player is led to believe that there is something eerie going on in the woods, and there isn't really an option to opt out of these elements of the game. The player must go searching for answers at the Wapiti station, all paths lead to the same ending, and I don't fault anyone for immersing themselves into this fantasy of something grander going on. This too is the developer's intent. The ending is anticlimactic by design, but that doesn't change the fact that it is still, well, anticlimactic. The reason I'm spending so much time on this point is because I want to make it known that I empathize with both sides of the argument. So where does that leave us? Before you label me as a fence-sitter, let me explain this final point. It would be extremely easy to just say that you didn't get the ending. I don't want to make that point because it's pretentious and flies in the face of the experience that many people had with the game. This is a critique that should be pointed towards the developers, not the players, and I can say that even though I personally like the ending being anticlimactic isn't saved by it being intentional from the developers. I would even say that the blame is on the developers for leading the players on with more interesting solutions to a problem that had a very basic solution. It deliberately subverts the audience's expectations, which is always a risky move. So why did it work for me? I was fully enthralled in Henry's experiences through this game. The prologue made me understand why Henry took the Firewatch job, and his transformation from a depressed man into someone who finds an outlet for his grief through Delilah was very immersive. As the conspiracy elements became more prominent, I got lost in the mystery. I noticed that I wasn't thinking about Henry's backstory as much as I was thinking about what was actually going on in the woods. Just like Henry, I momentarily forgot about Julia. For me, forgetting the prologue of course made more sense, as I perceived that to just be Henry's backstory, the reason he takes the Firewatch job, and why someone might want to research him. I was fully immersed in this Twin Peaks mystery and ready to find out that the people who were listening in on me weren't actually researchers, but aliens or some sort of all-human hybrids. It does get very creepy. And at that point you also start to think about like, the possibilities of what could be going on. And I remember when I played this game for the first time in like 2020, I was convinced that it was going to be aliens. And it's definitely not aliens. And when the end came, I realized what had just happened. I had forgotten the reason I was in the Shoshane. I had forgotten that Henry was actually married. I forgot that this job would only last for this summer. I didn't realize that this had all just been a grand fantasy to escape something else. I don't think I've ever experienced something like this in a video game. A game has never said to me, stop escaping, face your problems, you dolt, like this. What made this even more bizarre was that this happened while playing a video game, the thing that I usually use to distract myself from things that actually matter. In that sense, I realized that despite the ending being anticlimactic, it had achieved the exact thing that it set out to do. Of course, I can verify that this was the developer's intention, I didn't make the game, but as an experience, the game had got me. Hook, line, and sinker. Before we wrap up, I have a confession to make. My enjoyment of this game is highly circumstantial. I didn't play this game in 2016 because my then computer's 570 Ti didn't seem up to the challenge presented by this game. I played Firewatch for the first time in 2020, not knowing the story or the gameplay elements. All I knew was that people found the game disappointing, the PewDiePie thing, and that the concept art for the game had become wallpaper fetish material. When I played Firewatch originally, it was winter and the world was embroiled in a global pandemic. It's impossible to understate how much these circumstances affected my enjoyment of the game. I was stuck indoors, alone most of the time, and here was this narrative about a guy who escapes into nature to stay alone, but isn't able to do so. Despite everything that has been said about this game's ending and the gameplay, I really enjoy it, and I find it surprising how rarely the game is brought up as a recommendation on the narrative side. The title of this video wasn't clickbait. I truly believe that we have forgotten this game due to its ending. I'm not going to argue against the numerous people who feel that the ending was anticlimactic, as they seem to be a large majority. However, I don't think the ending's flaws justify how little praise this game has received in the last 7 years. I know it's a part of the culture to just move on to the next thing, but Firewatch still feels like a game you can easily recommend in 2023. It hasn't aged a day. Firewatch feels like a vacation. It's a game condensed into a warm hug. I wouldn't hesitate a second recommending Firewatch to someone who enjoys narrative-based games. Thank you for sticking with this video all the way through. I would love to hear what you think about Firewatch and your thoughts on this video in the comments. I don't have a Patreon, I don't think we're there yet, so the best way to support me at the moment would be to subscribe and turn on the notifications. I appreciate everyone who has been supporting me during the last 3 months. It has been amazing, just amazing to see how many people have enjoyed the things that I've created. And as a person who created content for years without it ever being seen, I can't even describe how it feels that these videos have been popping off lately. I appreciate every single one of you. I truly do. And yeah. I've also been uploading on my second channel, Crit Live. For example, the stream in which I abstained from talking as Henry can be found there, along with recaps of HBO's The Last of Us and a stream in which I played Signalis. So if that sounds like something you're into, you might want to subscribe to that also. I've put the link in the description. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video. It really does mean a lot to me. I know that I'm saying this in every single video in the outro nowadays, but like it really does. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'm headed off to Ocean Shawnee, where the birds and the bees won't know me. Man and war won't exist no more, and there ain't no gals to keep no score. I'm taking off for the woods, to a place where there ain't no shoots, Don't need no books or ponds or the ponderosas. Don't need no lady or marry the Mariposas. Can't waste no time in getting there. I'll do 80 down, 80 without a prayer. Don't need no gal, I'll spruce up for the spruces. Don't need no pal, I'll change my mood up for the mooses. Headed off to Shoshone, where the birds and the bees won't know me. Men and war won't exist no more, and there ain't no gals to keep no score. And if you're wondering where's my aspen, it's been cavorting amongst the aspens. Don't need no grass, I'll get altered among the alders. Don't need no mass, I'll grovel before the boulders. I'm headed off to Shoshone, where the birds and the bees won't know me. Men and war won't exist no more, and there ain't no gals to keep no score. I'm headed off to Shoshone, where the elk and the owls won't know me, where there ain't no judges to whom I gotta plead, 'cause I can be me in Shoshone.